Hello and welcome to Modern GUIs in Unity 4.6. My name is Nelson Lakay, and in this series we are going to be taking a look at the new GUI system. If you guys have been working with Unity for a while, you probably started to get pretty fed up of the old immediate mode UI. Now, immediate mode UI used to be all the rage a while ago, and when I say a while ago, quite a few years ago. It was really this really cool idea to be able to write your GUI in code, and it was so simple and straightforward, but it's not so great for a lot of reasons. It's not great for building complex interactions with the user through the UI. It's not so great when doing animations. It's not so great when we have a designer who doesn't know how to code who wants to make a UI. So Unity recognized this, and they recognized this quite a few years ago and have been promising us a new UI system for a decent amount of time. Well, it's finally here, mostly. You're going to be able to gain access to the new Unity UI by downloading the 4.6 beta as it stands right now. However, all you guys are in the future, and since you're in the future, you probably might already have access to 4.6 or 5.0. Any of those products will work fine with what we're about to show. Now, fortunately for us, the UI is actually pretty stable. I haven't ran into a lot of issues, and the issues that I have ran into, I've just outlined in this video series, and they're very few and far between. So don't worry a whole lot about any crashes. I've ran into a few rendering bugs here and there in the scene view that disappear when I hit play. I've also ran into one time I was working with an auto layout group and it wouldn't work until I reached the editor. But basically, for a beta, that's not that bad, especially considering how new the system is and how it hasn't really been in our hands, well, since now. So, in this video series, we're going to talk a lot about the GUI system. We're going to talk mainly about, in the first part, we're going to talk mainly about the core concepts. Now, the GUI system is the system that's designed around a very few core concepts, things like the Rect Transform, and that include your anchors and your pivots. And these core concepts have been carefully thought out by the Unity developers to make sure that a variety of different UIs are available for creation. So we won't run into a limitation saying, oh, we can't do this because, we can't anchor in that position. Unity guys thought a lot about it, and I think they did a pretty good job at coming up with a very good baseline. The whole concept with the canvas and the whole concept with our different renders and our Rect Transforms and all that stuff is a very, very good base that we can use to construct more complex user interfaces out of. I'm pretty sure that the UI is going to be a little bit different for you guys in the future who are the final release of 4.6. I have a feeling that Unity is going to include some pre-made widgets and things like maybe tab controls or menu controllers or maybe different sprites bundled in default. I just have a feeling that's going to happen. But the good news is that doesn't invalidate a single thing in this series. And here's why. The whole GUI system, like I said previously, is based around some core concepts. Once you understand those core concepts, you are good to go. You can pretty much create whatever you want. So as we'll see, we can get away with creating a lot of different effects with very, very little code. So this series is broken into two parts. The first part, which will be released for free, or is released for free, since you guys are watching this in the future. It's really hard to think like that. Kind of messes up my brain a little bit. But first part will be free, and we'll talk about the basic core tenets of the UI system. We're going to get all the basic stuff out of the way. We're going to talk very in depth about the Rect Transform and anchors and pivots. We're going to talk about things like selectables and buttons and text and sliders and all that fun stuff. Then we're going to work a lot with animations. We're going to see how the animation system can integrate with the UI system. And then finally, at the end of part one, we're going to bring all that stuff together and build the menu system you see in front of you right now. So you'll see that I can come here and I can hit something like high scores, and I see a high scores window come in. Or I could click on options and I see an options come in. You'll notice that they all have these really nice transitions. They have these really fluid animations, all customizable in the animation editor to your liking. Well, that's in a very, very important aspect because the most exciting thing about this menu system isn't that it works as well as it does with a very, very small amount of code. It has two scripts, they're very small, but that you can give this scene to your designer and he can sit here, as long as he understands the GUI system, he can sit there and make it look like however he wants without even touching the code. Let's see what that looks like. If I go ahead and uncheck hit play, and I go into the scene view, look what we see here. We see all of our menus, and they're all just sitting out here in the void of the space. Basically, the way that I have approached working with this UI system is a massive emphasis on what you see is what you get editing. So what I mean by that is when I have panels that are going to be shown and hidden, I like to make sure that those panels are still visible in the scene editor so I can edit them without tweaking other values or enable a game object or disabling a game object. What happens when I hit play, if I jump back into the scene view, you'll see that they disappeared. They actually oriented themselves back into the center of the screen. So you won't have to worry because somebody might be saying, oh, well, your panels are over there in the thing. If the resolution of the screen changes, then, we'll be able to see those panels floating there. Well, they won't because I reorient them into the center once the game starts. But you will definitely see throughout this series, and especially in part 2, we're going to put a very large emphasis on designer-friendly, what you see is what you get editing. So again, the first part, we talk about the core tenets. We're going to talk about how anchors and pivoting works, selectables, how navigation works between elements, how animation works, how we can create a menu system with a few lines of code. And when I say a few lines of code, I mean it. I mean, look at this. We have our menu script, which looks like that. And then we have our menu manager, which looks like that. I mean, that's all the code that we have. With that little code, we have a very extensible main menu system that you guys could use in your own projects without any issue. And that it all works using the animation system and the GUI system and all that fun stuff. So it all comes together very nicely. So that's going to be the first part. And that's all going to be really free because I think it's really important that everybody understands how to use this UI like it's intended to be used. Remember, this UI has a massive emphasis on editing the UI in the editor. And being able to edit the UI in the editor might be a little challenging for people who are unfamiliar with this system. So I really want to show you guys how to kind of think outside the box and ensure that your scenes are designer friendly. Even if you're a designer watching this right now and you're not interested in code, that's fine. I mean, this is a great introduction for somebody who doesn't want to look at a lot of code because we don't look at a lot of code. If you're a developer, even if you're a developer who is also a designer, well, guess what? You're still going to have to design your UIs. Would you rather do that in a massive 700 million line long on GUI function? Or do you want to do that using the tools that already has just released? Anyway, so I hope you guys enjoyed part 1. Part 1 is really fun to put together. I'm in love with this new system. Let's talk a little bit about part 2. And you can go ahead and get your hands on part 2 by heading over to 3dbuzz.com. Before you guys the project, however, I do want to point something out. Now, part 1 is not very code heavy. In fact, even if you're not a developer, even if you don't even know C#, I still encourage you to go through it. The amount of code is so trivial that it just doesn't matter. However, part 2 will be code heavy. Code heavy in the sense that we still need to describe our game logic somehow. How do we describe the game logic? Well, we describe game logic through code. We'll be using C# to do that. I recommend a beginner to intermediate level of understanding of C#. Now, we're not going to go through things like what a class is or what a function is. And whenever I pop in something that might be a little bit beyond what a beginner to intermediate developer would know, I make special note of it and talk about exactly what I'm doing. So don't be afraid of the if you're at a beginner to intermediate level, but don't expect a tutorial in C# either. Now, if you go over to 3dbuzz.com, there are plenty of free C# resources that you can go through to kind of get up to speed with how to use C#, at least enough of it to understand what's going on in the game. But just remember, part 2 will require some code. Part 1 doesn't really. Part 1 is pretty designer friendly. Anybody can go through it. Again, part 2 will have a decent amount of C# in it. But that's exactly what part 2 is all about. Just remember, part 2 is showing you guys how to take all of this stuff and actually make it into a game. How to see the games from start to to see how I organized everything and put everything together and made sure I didn't sacrifice designability, which is a word I just invented, by the way. I said it first. Designability of the UI from within the editor. So yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at that project. And I'm just going to open up the project right here. So this is the project, the scene, the game scene, where our game is contained. And you'll notice that I have a similar thing where I have the win screen, the lose screen, and the options menu kind of sitting outside in the screen space so that I can edit it while I'm in design mode. So what is this? What are we going to do in part 2? Well, we're going to put together a memory matching game. And we're going to do it entirely with the GUI system. What do I mean? I mean every single visual aspect of this game is going to be rendered with the GUI. Now you might, if you're familiar with Unity's old immediate mode GUI, you might, wow, that's a terrible idea. GUI sucks. Well, this one doesn't. Meaning I can get away with making a very compelling, very easy to use game user interface with just using the UI without sacrificing any flexibility, really at all. In fact, I gain flexibility. Because, I mean, really, you're not just limited to using what you can get in the designer. As you'll see in part 2, you can actually extend the whole UI system for things like auto layouts. And that allows you to really express anything that you want. Can't do it in the GUI system as it stands? Write a C# file, plug into the extensible UI, and then drop it as a component. You can see an example with our game board. This game board has these tiles, and they're all positioned through code. And what's cool about that is positioned through code, but we're seeing it in the editor. So how does that happen? How does Unity facilitate that? Well, you guys are going to learn how to do this in part 2, and it's going to be awesome. Anyway, so we have our game, and you see all these elements. Let's go ahead and hit play and see what this game actually is. So you'll see it starts off with this really basic interface. The game board disappears, no options, whatever. We can click on options. We can set our options here, like let's say tiles per row. Let's make this game easy. Go to 2, 2. I know I haven't even told you guys what this game does yet, but we'll see momentarily. Then I'll hit start game. This is a basic memory matching game. So you'll notice that we have a time left. We have these tiles that we can drag here from the gutter, and we can drop them into these little slots. When we drop them into the correct slot, we get points. I, for the life of me, cannot remember what went in the next tile. So I'm just going to guess and get a bunch of negative points because I apparently have no memory. You know, people always assume just because you made a game, you're good at it. Well, that is not true at all for anything. Oh, come on. This is just embarrassing now. There we go. I won with negative 70 points, but at least I had 26.55 seconds left. Anyway, so this is a very simple memory tile matching game. We can make it a little bit more interesting by upping the tiles per row to 4 and 4 and hitting start game. Now the game gets a little bit more interesting. And you'll also notice that we also talk about resolution as well. In the end of the series, in the last video, we actually make this phone work with mobile phones, working with under the constraints of a mobile device. And you'll see how to do that as well. But that's why the screen looks really big right now. It's really scaled up. Just note that that's something we added to make it friendly with phones. If you were writing a standalone, you would put in some different settings for your resolution. But for this, looks good. Looks great on my phone, and hopefully it looks great on yours too. So yeah, that is our memory game. We construct it purely out of UI elements. You'll see we have this little thing up here with our hierarchy with all our GUI elements, and we put them all together, and then we throw scripts on them, and we get behavior. In part 2, you'll also see a really cool event-driven system that's just going to use normal C# events to describe the state of the game so that our user interface is completely decoupled from our game logic. And that's really, really important. Furthermore, I really take the whole concept of what you see is what you get editing very far with this, because I think it's one of the most important things that you can do when designing user faces. So how do I do that? Well, you'll notice that I have multiple scenes. These two little what I call workspaces. And I use these workspaces to test components in isolation. So, like I said, in addition to talking about the UI and some things we can do with it, the emphasis of part two is really showing how we can bring it all together, how we can create complex interactions without sacrificing the ability to edit it in design mode, and without alienating old designers who don't want to learn how to write code, but still want to do their job. So yeah, part two is lots of fun. So head on over to 3dbuzz.com and grab yourself a copy of that. But anyway, getting back into our project itself, I'm going to be putting together in part one. Again, this is our end goal. Now, we're going to be putting together the menu as the last video. The rest of the video is going to be the prerequisites. I highly, highly encourage people to not skip those videos in the middle. We will show a quick example of how to build something really fast in the next video, but keep in mind that in order to work with the UI system without getting frustrated, you must understand the Rect Transform and the other things that we will be describing in fundamental lessons. If you don't, you will be fighting with it. But when you do, suddenly just everything opens up. All the possibilities open up, and it becomes a very, very wonderful system to work with. Alright guys, I hope you have as much fun watching these videos as I did putting them together. So let's go ahead. Alrighty. This video is going to be a quick crash course into the new Unity GUI system. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be downloading and installing Unity 4.6 beta, and then we're going to be jumping into it and putting together a really simple demonstration project. Now, you guys could follow along if you want to, but it should be sufficient just to watch what I'm going to be putting together. The purpose of this video is to get you guys kind of, a overview of how it is Unity expects you to be building GUIs now, because it's quite a fundamentally different way than we're used to with the immediate mode on GUI system. So I really wanted to show you guys just some really basic stuff. How do we create things like sliders and buttons, and how do we wire up events, just to get you guys kind of in the mood for working with this system, since it is such a huge, huge shift. And in some videos, we're going to be taking a look at each of one of the individual components, line item by line item, checking out what we can do with them and all that great stuff. But again, I think it's really important to get a good feel for what we're going to be doing first before we dive into the specifics. So we will be talking about a little bit about panels and canvases and Rect Transforms, but the really in-depth discussion is going to happen in later videos. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing you're going to want to do is grab the Unity 4.6 beta. Easiest way to do that is to jump over to unity3d.com. Click on this little guy right there. Hit Get Unity 4.6 beta. And in this video series, I'm going to be using the beta 18. If you're using the beta 17, I believe pretty much everything should still work, but beta 18 is the one I'm going to be using. So go ahead and download it for your operating system. And while it's downloading, let me go ahead and explain how you can go ahead and get two different installations of Unity on the same computer at the same time, because I think a lot of you guys already have the installation that you really don't want to compromise while playing around with the beta, because especially if you have an application that's in production, you're going to want to be able to, maintain that application while you are learning how to use the new GUI system. So it's really a basic process. All you have to do is tell it to install Unity to a different folder. It's not going to remove the old Unity installation unless it detects one inside of the folder that you were installing it to. I do want to really quickly point out, however, that you really need to install it as a sibling folder of the other Unity installation at the very least. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I go ahead and open up my program files x86 folder right over here, you'll that I have my Unity and my Unity 4.5. And so I installed them as siblings of each other. What I mean by that is, they're next to each other in the same parent. Because if you to install a different Unity installation, for example, within the Unity folder itself, thinking that it won't conflict with the editor folder, you might run into issues. And these issues are outlined in the Unity manual. So be sure to not do that. If you're going to install two Unity installations side by side, make sure that you do them in separate folders entirely. So for example, as separate folders in your program files, separate folders that are across different hard drives, so on and so on. It doesn't really matter where you put the other installation, as long as it's not anywhere inside the previous installation. Anyway, once you do that, you will have two versions of Unity going side by side, and that should be what you want for playing with the new beta. So after installation, what I did was I just jumped into my Unity folder, jumped into my editor folder, and just grabbed the Unity exe and plopped it into my taskbar, which is what you see right here. So when I click on this Unity editor, I am opening up the Unity Beta 4.6 Beta 18. So you might want to pause the video if you're still installing, but if you're done, let's go ahead and jump right in and put together something really basic. Again, just really basic crash course stuff, not going in depth yet, but it should give you guys a good feel of what's to come. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Unity. Go ahead to create new project, and I'm just going to say new Unity project 3. Why not? Hit create. Name's not really going to matter. Okay, so in Unity, everything should look pretty familiar at this point. So your first question might be, well, how do I start making a GUI? To start making a GUI, you're going to have to create what's called a canvas. Now, a canvas is kind of the parent of all GUI elements. All GUI elements must be parented to, or must be a descendant of, a canvas. So the canvas is what controls where the Unity GUI is going to be rendered in your scene. So to do that, I'm going to go up here to my hierarchy. I'm going to right-click anywhere inside of this blank space in my hierarchy. Open up this new little UI dropdown, and I'm going to click on Canvas. So you'll notice a couple cool things happened. First of all, we got an event system in addition to our canvas. We'll talk about that later. And then we got this canvas guy. And if I double this canvas guy, you'll notice he's really, really, really big. And the reason for this is canvases are actually described in pixels, where one unit corresponds to one pixel, which means that this canvas is going to be very big, because if you look right here on the right-hand side, you'll notice it's 957 by 600. Now that measurement is in pixels, but when we view the canvas inside of our system, inside of our scene, we will see that rendered as units. So 1 pixel equals 1 unit, therefore we get this really, really massive canvas. As a quick example, I could go ahead and create a 3D cube and place it somewhere, like 0, 0, 0, and you can't even see that cube. You know, I would have to scale it up really, 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 really big just to make it even visible when I'm viewing the canvas like this. So I really wanted to point this out. Basically, that's why the canvas is so big. It's not a bug or an issue or anything like that. It doesn't really conflict with how we're going to go about building our GUIs. Position of the canvas in this case does not matter. Canvases can be created as different types, and those different types of canvases dictate where those canvases are going to be positioned on the screen. Well, this type of canvas, it doesn't matter where it's positioned. So this is irrelevant. It's going to be painted directly onto our main camera, regardless of where it's physically located. So that's another important aspect of this. Remember, you can't have multiple canvases, and we'll talk about that later. But again, the canvas is really just the root element of a GUI. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that cube, and let's start working with our canvas. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hop into 2D mode. And 2D mode is really handy when working with the Unity GUI system because it allows us to view our objects as an orthographic projection inside of our scene view, which is really handy when working with a predominant GUI-based GUI system. All right, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and do something more fun, I guess, and that's create a panel. So let's right-click Canvas, go to UI, and hit Panel. Now we have a panel. So I didn't really talk about what the inspector looks like with the canvas, because we're going to talk about these other fun things later. But now that we're in the panel, we'll start to notice a little bit of a common thread among everything that's parented to a canvas at some point. And that is our transform is replaced with this Rect Transform. So the Rect Transform is basically the new GUI's equivalent of a normal transform and allows us to do everything from scaling to rotation, but it also allows us to describe where this element should be positioned relative to parents. And it allows us to do some really, really cool things. So you'll notice right here, the panel is actually filling the entire canvas. And into the game view, you'll notice that as well. You'll notice, though, is while I change the dimensions of my game view, two things seem to happen. First, the size of the canvas changes. In this canvas mode, the size of the canvas is always going to be determined by the size of, or the resolution of the main camera, as you can see right here. As I change the resolution of the camera, so does the canvas size change. You'll also notice that the panel size changes as well. And that's because the panel is currently set to fill its parent being the canvas. So change that behavior. How do we make it so, let's say I want the panel to be 200 pixels wide, and I want it to only be docked on the right-hand side of the screen, and I don't want it to resize. Well, that's easy to do. We can come over here up to our Rect Transform. We can click this handy little square doohickey right there, and we can see all sorts of these preset Rect Transforms we can create. Now we can even create custom Rect Transforms and do some really neat things with that, but that's going to be something we'll discuss later. For now, what I want to accomplish is I want, again, this panel to be 200 pixels wide, and I want it to be docked on the right-hand side of the screen. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to click this. That preset right there will make the panel be on the right-hand side of the screen, basically. So you might be wondering, well, it doesn't look any different. But if I come over here to my game view and I stretch it to the left, look at that. Now it no longer is taking into consideration the screen. So it looks like I'm about halfway there. You'll notice that it also doesn't stretch horizontally, which we'll address here as well. So let's address the stretching horizontally bit first. I'm going to come here, and I'm also going to click on stretch vertically, sorry. So we want left, and we want stretch right here. So this button right here, you see that we'll stretch vertically, and we want to be docked to the right-hand side. Now if we come over here and start expanding it, you'll notice that it does stretch, but there's still this padding in between the top and the bottom that we would like to get rid of. The easiest way to do that is actually to use a handy little trick with this anchor presets, and I'll reiterate this handy little trick later in case you guys are getting a little confused at all these new options. But if you hold down Alt and Shift and then click on this, you'll notice that it'll expand to fit the entirety of the vertical space, which now our panel will behave almost exactly how we want it to. You'll notice that it's stuck to the right-hand side, it doesn't change its width, and it always fills the height, which is really cool. But we definitely want that width. So how do we do that? Well, if you look at the Rect Transform, if you've been paying really, really close attention, you may have noticed that the actual parameters of the Rect Transform change depending on our docking mode, which is also really cool because they make sense based on the context of what we're doing. So you'll notice that I now have this option for width. So for example, I can type in 200 and I now have it constrained to 200 pixels wide. Coming back here to the game view, you'll now notice that the panel behaves exactly like I expect it to. That's a really, really quick introduction to some of the things we can do with the Rect Transform. There's a whole lot more we can do with it, and we'll talk about that more in depth later. I do want to go ahead and introduce a couple of bits of padding though, because you'll notice that by default our panels use the nice little rounded rectangle doohickey. Well, I don't like how that looks on the screen. I think it would look a lot better if we introduced some padding. We can do this visually, of course, by clicking on our panel and selecting the Rect Transform tool right here, which is a new addition in Unity 4.6. This can also be activated by hitting the Y key on your keyboard. And once we do that, we can adjust our padding however we want. Or, if we want to be a little bit more precise, we could also come over here to the Rect Transform. I can set its position 10 to negative, or position X to -10, its top to 10, and its bottom to 10. This gives us about 10 units of padding. But despite that padding, you'll notice that our previous behaviors, vertical stretching combined with horizontal stickiness to the right, is preserved. Anyway, so that's really cool. We'll talk again more about Rect Transforms later. Next thing I want to go ahead and do is let's place a slider. No, let's right-click Panel, because I want it to be a child of Panel. I'm going to click UI, and I'm going to create a slider. Now, the behavior of the slider is I want the slider to stick to the top of this panel. Very easy way to do that is to open up our Rect Transform presets, hold down Alt and Shift, and click that button right there. Now, it is at the top of the panel. Furthermore, you'll notice that it sticks to the top of the panel. Just like with our panel, we can introduce some padding to it by specifying a left of 10, a right of 10, and how about a position of -10? By doing that, we have now successfully created some padding, and our behaviors are expected. All right. Let's go ahead and talk about some interaction. Well, let's do a button next. Let's do a button, and then we'll talk about interaction, because I want to show you guys how we can create a button and create a click handler for that button, because that's the thing I think is really important to understand. I hope you guys are so far kind of getting a feel for how the Rect Transforms work. So next up, I really want to show you guys how you could handle an event, because handling an event is really pretty much all UIs do besides presenting information. So on this panel right here, I'm going to add another child to it by right-clicking UI Button. And this button, I want it to be at the bottom of the panel, and I want it to be stickied to the bottom of the panel. Now again, naively, I could do this, but if I did that, you'll notice it doesn't quite stick. It kind of like moves as I resize vertically, which isn't the behavior I'm looking for. So I'm going to do just like we did with the slider, open up this little Rect Transform helper, hold down Alt and Shift, and click down here to the bottom. Then I'm going to give it a padding of 10 by giving it a left of 10, a position of 10, a right of 10, and now we have that 10 units of padding, giving us very fine control over how we want this displayed. So let's say that when we click the button, we want this slider, the value of this slider, to be printed to our console. So it seems like a really straightforward thing to do, and I think it's a good example because A, it shows how we can handle a click event, B, it shows how we can extract the value of the slider, and then, well, really, that's about all. But still, good stuff. So let's go ahead and get that worked out. So in the immediate mode GUI, handling a click event is pretty straightforward. You just type in if GUI.button, then do something. Well, in this system, it's a little bit more complex, but more simple at the same time, which is a really interesting way that they went about this. It's actually the way we can handle events in the GUI system is ridiculously flexible. And it's very straightforward once you have seen an example of it being done. Basically, when we have our button here, and we have the button selected in the hierarchy, remember, the button selected, not the text. It's very easy to accidentally select the text by double-clicking on the button, but make sure that you have the button selected. You'll notice that it has this button script attached to it. The button script has this onClick, which says list is empty. Basically, I can fill this list with things I want to happen when the button is clicked. So what determines a thing that I want to have happen? Basically, any function that meets a particular criteria on any game object in the entire scene can be invoked by simply filling out this onClick list. So let's go ahead and do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a mono behavior. I'm going to create C# and I'm going to call this button test. And then I'm going to sync mono develop project. Wait a year or two. And then hope Studio is going to open up properly, and it does. Okay, so our button test is basically going to be a game object that'll be responsible for responding to a click event from the button that we placed in the scene. But again, I did say earlier that I wanted it to take the value of the slider printed out to the console. So our button test is going to need a reference to our slider. It's very simple to do. We'll just type in public slider, and now you'll notice that autocomplete actually doesn't show you anything. The reason it doesn't is because most of the objects or the classes that we're going to be dealing with when working in the new GUI system are going to be located in the Unity Engine.UI namespace. So Unity is finally embracing the concept that you can have multiple namespaces, which is cool. But it'll also require everybody wanting to work with the UI and code to add a using statement up at the top of the file of using Unity Engine.UI. So make sure you have that. Okay, so now that we have our public slider field, I'm going to name it. I'll just name it slider because I'm not a very big person. So now what do we have to do? Well, again, I want this button to be notified when the button in our scene view is clicked. So basically what we have to do is we have to create a method that follows a particular criteria. The method must be public. The method must return void. It can be named anything. And it must take in 0 parameters. So let's get that 0 parameters. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say debug.log slider.value.toString. Something will simply debug log slider value toString. Because this method is public and it's void and it takes 0 parameters, I can use this as a target for my button click. So jumping back into Unity, let's go ahead and do just that. The first thing I need to do is actually instantiate my button test component somewhere in the scene. So what I can do is I can come over here to my hierarchy. I can right click and I can say create empty. And then I'm going to call this button responder. Now the button responder game object I'm going to add a button test component to. So I'm going to take button test and I'm going to click and drag it over into inspector. Now remember, our button responder does need a reference to our slider component, which is this guy right up here. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the button responder game object. I'm going to take the slider over here in our hierarchy, and I'm going to click and drag it into the slider property of our button test script. And then once I drop it there, it's associated. So that's really all the setup we need, because now we have a target for the button to invoke. So I'm going to click the button. I'm going to scroll down to the on-click list. I'm going to hit plus. And notice that this line item appeared. And it's going to have these 4 things on it, 4 pieces of data. Whether or not it's enabled, what's the target game object, what's the target function, and what parameter to pass to it, if any. So the first question is, what's a game object? Well, if we click on this little circly guy here, we can select our button responder. Well, in fact, we could select anything we wanted, but in this case, we're selecting our button responder. Now we have to select the position. So we click on this little drop down, and we're going to see it organized by component. So each component is going to get its own little drop down menu. We're going to want to select the button test component, and now select any one of these values. The one we're going to want to select is the doThing method. And that's it. Our button when now clicked, will invoke the doSomething method on the button responder object. Let's test that out. I'm going to go ahead and hit play. Then I'm going to hit the button, and we get 1 printed out. Let's move the slider down a little bit, and we get a fractional value, and we get 0, and we get another about halfway-ish, and so on, and so on. All right, I do want to point out one quick thing that we could also do in addition to what we did with the on-click. I don't want to get too in depth with event handling because we have a whole video about that coming up. But for now, I just want to show you something else that's really cool. I'm going to delete that handler. I'm going to go back into code, and up here on my my button test, I'm going to create another method. I'm going to say public void do something with a slider. And then I'm going to just print out slider value to string. Note that I'm doing the lowercase slider, which is provided to me as a parameter and not the uppercase field. So I just want to demonstrate one other really cool thing about looking up events in the new GUI system. You'll notice in our previous example, we had the slider reference added from within the inspector. But what if we wanted to provide the slider as a parameter? We'll actually do that with the new GUI system. The GUI system can, like I said, accept events or methods as events if they have 0 to 1 parameters, and if that parameter is a game object, or rather an object, a string, an int, a bool, a float, and a couple other I'm probably forgetting, basically primitive types. So now that we've created this method, let's jump back into Unity and come over here to our button and hit add. Drag over our button responder, click on the no function, open up button test, go down to do something with a slider, and now you'll notice that we can now fill in the parameter. Well, what's the parameter that we're going to want to fill it in with? Well, it's the slider object that we already created in the panel. So coming over here to our hierarchy and clicking and dragging the slider over into this little parameter or argument doohickey right here, dropping it there, we'll actually provide that as a parameter to the function when it's invoked. So now what I can do is I can hit play, and I'll get the exact same behavior, although we didn't statically provide the slider to the button responder. We provided it as a parameter. All right, there's 2 more things I want to show you guys before we'll head off into some more in-depth discussions. And that is a really powerful new cool ability with images and how to hook up slider values to other values. So let's look at images first. I'm going to go in here into my panel, right click, create new UI. I'm going to create an image. Now this image I'm going to leave in the center of the screen. I'm not going to worry about positioning it. Then we're going to go over here to the image component on the image game object, and on the source image, I'm going to click this little circly doohickey, and I'll select one of our built-in source images. Make a check mark. Okay, so that's really cool so far. We can add images to it. Actually, that's not particularly exciting, but still, it can be really cool because the images now support the concept of this image type. We'll talk about the other image types later, but for now, let's just talk about the sliced one, because I find this particularly interesting. If we click on sliced, or whoops, not sliced, filled. Derp to derp. All right, if we click on filled, we can actually use this fill amount property that appears to determine how much of the image is filled. I don't know, when I was learning the whole new GUI system, this is one of my favorite things because it makes things all really easy to put together. For example, we could use this to put together a speedometer. Or if we change the fill method to horizontal, we can use this as a health bar. So that was just something that particularly made me happy when I saw it. Lots of fun stuff. So we have our fill amount, and that's really cool. But another interesting thing we can show here before signing off is the ability for the slider to actually send events. So if I click on the slider, you'll notice if I scroll down that he has an on value changed. And you'll notice this little parenthesis, single parenthesis. That means that this on value changed needs to accept a method that takes in a float and won't accept anything else. Will if it's a parameterless. So let's go ahead and click the add button. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this image right here. This is the image that I have selected right in the hierarchy. And I'm going to click and drag it over into the target object of the on value changed. Then for the function, I'm going to select image. Then on dynamic float, I'm going to select fill amount. So now I'm going to hit run. And you'll notice as I change the slider, the fill amount also changes. In fact, I can see that represented in the inspector as well. If I click on the image over here in my hierarchy and look at the inspector, watch the fill amount as I change my slider, you'll notice it changing. All right. Well, anyway, this was really just a quick rundown of the GUI system. I really wanted to show you guys how to start using it by creating a canvas, and I wanted to show you guys how to dock panels and how to create some basic interaction. So, this sort of thing should get you guys up and running relatively quickly, but there's a whole lot more that we need to discuss, and we're going to do that in a little bit more in depth here shortly.